London, the summer of 2015. A secret handover. A reporter from the British tabloid The Sun receives sensitive movie footage from an informer. The pictures are political dynamite. They show Elizabeth II as a small girl, her mother and her uncle Edward. They are all performing a Nazi salute. How close were the royals to the Nazis? New reports show that after his abdication, Edward hoped that Hitler would conquer England and return him to the throne. Was the Duke of Windsor a traitor?
Was Edward VIII just a pacifist, or was he pro-Nazi? We're starting to see through these intelligence documents inside the mind of Edward VIII.
I think he greatly overestimated his own popularity with the British people at that time.
Newly discovered letters reveal the driving force behind his possible treason.
I think clearly in that relationship, Wallis is in charge.
For decades, historians have been searching for proof of Edward's willingness to cooperate with the Nazis. Recently, new evidence has come to light. In the General Archive in Madrid, historian Carina Urbach has made a sensational discovery. A pile of secret dispatches seems to indicate that Edward was prepared to betray his country. In the summer of 1940, the ex-king wrote to a friend, "If one bombed England effectively, this could bring peace."
Das muss man sich mal vorstellen, das ist das Schockierende an dieser Aussage, dass er tatsächlich behauptet, sein eigenes Land soll von Deutschland bombardiert werden. Also eine größere Art von Vaterlandsverrat gibt es überhaupt nicht.
The story of Edward's treachery started in 1934. The Prince of Wales was having an affair with Thelma Furness, the wife of a shipping magnate. She introduced him to her best friend, Wallis Simpson. The married American was to keep an eye on Edward while Thelma was away on holiday. But instead of preventing an affair, Wallis started one with the prince herself. Shortly afterwards, special agents from Scotland Yard placed the prince's new mistress under surveillance. Richard Aldrich, an expert on intelligence services, has studied the reports.
So in 1935 we have a remarkable situation where both the British King, George V, and also the Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin, get together to order a programme of espionage against the Prince of Wales. This is remarkable. The king doesn't normally spy on his son.
As long as Wallis remained just another of the prince's mistresses, George V wasn't worried. He knew about his son's string of affairs, but something else gave the royals cause for concern. Albert Canning of Scotland Yard reported that Edward was giving Wallis Simpson presents of up to £110,000 a year, which would be worth over $11 million today. And that's not all.
When Superintendent Canning undertakes his espionage, his investigations, he's very alarmed because he discovers that not only Wallis Simpson, but also her husband, Ernest, are effectively hustlers. He makes no secret of Wallis's association with the Prince of Wales, and indeed seeks to sort of enjoy the reflected glory of this, and he says, and to make capital from it.
A lot of what Wallis did was calculated. She and her husband Ernest rented an apartment near Buckingham Palace. Edward was soon a regular visitor, paying the rent for the cash-strapped couple. During Edward's visits, husband Ernest withdrew discreetly into his study, but he was not happy about the ménage à trois. In a letter to her Aunt Bessie, Wallis wrote, "Ernest and I had a long conversation about the Prince and me. Everything will go on as before. I shall try to be as smart as possible and keep them both. Don't pay any attention to tittle-tattle, dear Bessie." Wallis Simpson was two-timing him, but the Prince was blinded by love. The King was alarmed. How much longer should he watch his son being exploited by this woman? But it was about to get worse. The Simpsons introduced the Prince to their rightest friends. The King had the shady ladies' every step monitored. Each night, Scotland Yard agents lurked outside the Simpsons' apartment. And they hit pay dirt. Even though Wallis spent most of her time with Ernest and Edward, Superintendent Canning was able to uncover another affair. The Prince of Wales' mistress had another lover, Guy Trundle, a car salesman and womaniser. Wallis, in her turn, showered him with expensive presents. The King breathed a sigh of relief. But before long, Scotland Yard reported a new piece of bad news. Edward was meeting more and more often with fascists.
Edward and Wallis are meeting with people like Mosley, the head of the British Fascist Party, and a number of other leading right-wingers. And this is also a matter of concern to the British authorities, because Edward sees a lot of secret documents. And one of the things the espionage reveals is that Edward is not being careful with his top secret documents.
The government was afraid that Edward might let slip state secrets at dinner parties, where Oswald Mosley was also a guest. The young baronet was the rising star of the extreme right wing in Britain. In 1932, Mosley united the various fascist splinter groups in England and founded the British Union of Fascists. Mosley had studied Italian fascism and adopted Mussolini's central message: fight the Bolshevists under the leadership of a strong man.
Mosley ist ein großer PR-Mann und er weiß, wie man also seine Bewegung nach vorne bringt. Er spricht in großen Sälen, er weiß, dass man ein Stadion füllen kann mit diesen Kämpfertypen, die er da einlädt. Und er hat großen Zulauf anfangs.
In 1934, Mosley's party had, according to their own figures, 50,000 members. At that time, many in Europe saw fascism as a young, modern movement. Adolf Hitler's swift rise to power prompted Mosley to model himself on the Führer. He copied what he thought might be useful. Mosley introduced the greeting "Hail Mosley" and had himself called the leader. In the summer of 1935, Mosley and the Prince of Wales met for the first time. At a party held by Lady Cunard, London's preeminent society hostess, Wallis introduced the two men.
Wallis Simpson ist eine sehr geschickte Networkerin und sie erkennt natürlich sofort, dass es Damen der britischen Gesellschaft gibt, die unwahrscheinliche Macht haben, hinter den Kulissen Macht haben. Und eine davon ist Lady Cunard, eine Society Queen im Londoner der 30er Jahre, eine sehr reiche Frau. Ihr Mann war der Schiffseigner der Cunard-Linie und sie bringt also alle rechten Gruppierungen zusammen. Sie war eine Hitler-Verehrerin, sie verehrte Ribbentrop.
Agents were soon reporting secret meetings between the Prince and Oswald Mosley.
The police reports say that the Prince of Wales questioned Mosley about the strength and the policies of the British Union of Fascists, and these were explained to the Prince of Wales at length and in detail.
On the 20th of January 1936, George V died. Edward succeeded to the throne the very same day. Would the new monarch now stay out of politics? Edward watched the proclamation of his kingship from a window in St. James's Palace, together with Wallis. The new king was sending a signal. He would do what he thought was right. This applied to politics too. Edward made no secret of his liking for Hitler and National Socialism. This became quite apparent during the Rhineland crisis. In March 1936, Hitler sent troops into the Rhineland, which had been a demilitarised zone since 1918. This blatant breach of the Treaty of Versailles led to an international crisis. War seemed to be looming. But strangely, the government in London laid low and let Hitler have his way. According to a report from the German embassy in London, King Edward had demanded extreme restraint.
A German official later claimed that to have overheard a conversation with Edward, a telephone conversation, in which the king had said that he had threatened Baldwin that he might even abdicate if Britain acted with respect to the Rhineland crisis against Germany.
It was becoming obvious. The new king was dangerous. Edward VIII not only wanted to dictate politics and circumvent government, he also showed a great sympathy for fascism. Where did Edward's preference for the cult of the Führer come from? January 1936. Edward had only just taken the throne when Adolf Hitler and his advisors set their sights on their young king. His German uncle, Karl Eduard, was to influence him.
Karl Eduard von Coburg ist eine interessante Figur, weil er natürlich aus der Royal Family stammt. Also seine Großmutter ist Queen Victoria. Er ist eigentlich Brite, kommt dann aber als Teenager nach Deutschland und ist ein ganz großer Unterstützer von Hitler, schon sehr früh. Und Hitler erkennt, dass diese Verbindungen von Karl Eduard zu der Royal Family sehr, sehr nützlich sind, dass er ihn als Kanal von Deutschland nach Großbritannien benutzen kann, als propagandistischen Kanal, aber auch um Edward VIII. Persönlich näher zu kommen.
Karl Eduard, Duke of Saxe-Coburg, had supported Hitler's candidacy for the office of Reich President as far back as 1932. After Hitler assumed power, Karl Eduard became his most important aide in British relations.
Karl Eduard musste im Grunde nicht sehr viel tun, um Edward zu beeinflussen, denn er traf da auf einen Nährboden, der schon da war. Denn Edward war von Anfang an von der NSDAP begeistert. Es gibt Aussagen von ihm von 1933, dass er sagt, also was in Deutschland passiert, sowas bräuchten wir eigentlich auch.
But there were other reasons for the king's fondness for Germany's Nazi movement. Like Hitler, Edward saw communism as the arch-enemy. Memories of the murder of the Russian Tsar, Edward's godfather, and his family at the hands of the Bolshevists were still fresh.
Natürlich hat Edward auch Angst, dass der Kommunismus im Empire Fuß fasst und er weiß, dass in Indien die kommunistische Partei unterstützt wird von Moskau und deswegen sieht er also eine Doppelbedrohung. In Großbritannien und im Empire ist der Kommunismus auf dem Vormarsch und der will ihm und seiner Familie alles nehmen.
Edward's sister-in-law Elizabeth, later the Queen Mother, was also interested in politics. She travelled through Italy and Germany to observe fascism at close quarters. This controversial footage was taken a short while later and shows the Queen Mother and Prince Edward teaching a young Elizabeth how to perform a Hitler salute. Many people in Britain at the time looked up to Germany, which they perceived as economically strong. And Hitler? He saw Britain as a natural ally in his fight against communism.
Hitler wanted to have a free hand in Europe to do what he wanted, to seize the territories that he wanted without interference from any other power, particularly Britain. And certainly he saw the world being potentially divided into spheres of influence, where the Germans would be allowed to do what they wanted in Europe, the British would be allowed to sort of continue their empire.
Die britische Oberschicht und auch die Royal Family ist ganz der Ansicht, dass sie ihr Empire behalten wollen und dass Hitler einfach dafür sorgen kann, ihnen die Bolschewisten vom Hals zu halten. Er kann gegen Russland marschieren und diese Sache regeln.
Among the ranks of the upper classes, one woman stood out from the rest, Unity Mitford. The aristocrat was a passionate supporter of Hitler. Aged just 20, she moved to Munich in the hope of meeting her idol. Unity had the support of her parents. Her father, Lord Redesdale, was a member of the House of Lords, and her mother was a cousin of Winston Churchill's wife. Unity had joined the British Union of Fascists in 1933. Her sister Diana was having an affair with Oswald Mosley, the fascist leader. The Mitford sisters loved to watch the British fascists parade in the black uniforms they'd designed themselves. In October 1934, Unity moved to Schwabing in Munich. Each morning she took German classes. At lunchtime, she frequented Hitler's favourite restaurant, the Osteria Bavaria. Unity knew that it was only a matter of time before Hitler noticed her. She was tall, blonde and blue-eyed. It happened on the 9th of February 1935. Overcome with joy, Unity wrote to her sister Diana, "At 3 p.m. I was leafing through Vogue when the Führer came in and sat down at his regular table. 10 minutes later, he called the innkeeper over. The innkeeper then approached me and said, 'The Führer wants to talk to you.' You can imagine how I feel. I'm the happiest girl in the world." Hitler was very taken with the young Englishwoman. Unity soon became part of his entourage. By the outbreak of war in 1939, records show that Unity had met Hitler 140 times. She was often his personal guest, at Reich Party congresses, or the Olympic Games, or the Wagner Festival in Bayreuth. What did the dictator see in his 20-year-old groupie? Were they lovers? His architect and later armaments minister, Albert Speer, wrote about Unity Mitford.
Sie war direkt und sagte Dinge, die Hitler nicht passten. Die hatte Mumm, eine intelligente Frau.
Unity's sister Nancy also wrote about the unusual relationship.
Nancy Mitford ist ja die Schriftstellerin der Familie und sie ist sich von Anfang an ganz sicher, dass Hitler ihre Schwester auch benutzt hat. Dass er glaubte, ihre Familie wäre sehr einflussreich, dass er sie als eine Art Türöffner sah, um auch in der britischen Aristokratie vorwärts zu kommen.
At Hitler's request, Unity took on diplomatic tasks. She looked after British guests of honour at the Olympic Games and went to meetings at the Anglo-German Fellowship.
Die Anglo-German Fellowship wird von britischen Wirtschaftsgrößen gegründet und es ist eigentlich zuerst gedacht gewesen als eine Art Brückenbau, um mit der deutschen Wirtschaft in Kontakt zu kommen. Aber das verändert sich sehr schnell und es wird eine politische Gesellschaft. Sehr, sehr viele Rechtsradikale, auch des britischen Adels, sind Mitglieder und die geben dann ihre Dinnerpartys und laden Nazi-Größen ein nach Großbritannien und machen Reklame für sie. Und eine dieser Eingeladenen ist Stephanie von Hohenlohe.
Princess Stephanie had introduced herself to the new Reich Chancellor in Berlin in 1933. Like the Duke of Coburg, she wanted to put her aristocratic status at Hitler's service. Although she had only married into the nobility, Hitler took the bait. Both agreed that the princess should use her London connections to win the British over to Hitler and his cause. Stephanie had lived in England since 1933, working for the influential press baron Lord Rothermere, a self-admitted fascist and supporter of Hitler.
We have some newly declassified documents from MI6, the British Foreign Intelligence Service, and this exciting new material shows that Princess Stephanie was ordered by Hitler to try and persuade Lord Rothermere to support a campaign that favoured the transfer of land from Poland back to Germany, and has been promised a lot of money if she's successful.
In London, Stephanie rented an apartment in the plush suburb of South Kensington, and as luck would have it, an acquaintance of the princess's lived in the same block, Wallis Simpson.
Stephanie von Hohenlohe und Wallis Simpson werden sehr schnell Freundinnen. Also sie haben, glaube ich, sehr ähnliche Charaktere. Sie sind beide Aufsteigerinnen. Sie wissen genau, wo sie ihre Netzwerkarbeit ansetzen müssen. Und sie passen auch politisch ideal zusammen, denn sie sind beide rechtsaußen aktiv.
The two ambitious women were often seen at society parties. There they ran into confirmed fascists, including Lord Rothermere and Oswald Mosley. At these soirees, the Prince of Wales and his mistress were the centre of attention. Onlookers noted with amusement that Edward was under Wallis's thumb. He was practically eating out of her hand and couldn't bear to be parted from her for a second. Wallis was quite different. Irritated, she wrote to her Aunt Bessie, "I'm getting really tired of all this. 4 phone calls a day from the little king." But Wallis couldn't resist the royal lure. In July 1936, Edward gave a dinner party. For the first time, Wallis's name appeared on the guest list without her husband's. Under pressure from Edward, the Simpsons had filed for divorce. The public were kept ignorant of this development. The press remained tight-lipped at the government's request. But that was soon to change. In the summer of 1936, Edward and Wallis holidayed for several weeks on the Dalmatian coast. A photographer was struck by the elegant woman at the king's side. The story of Edward VIII and Mrs. Simpson hit the front pages of the international press.
Was im Sommer 36 passiert, gilt natürlich als großer Stilbruch, denn im Grunde kann man eine Mätresse haben, aber man sollte sie natürlich nicht zeigen. Und Edward VIII. Hat jetzt alle Hemmungen verloren und das konsterniert natürlich die europäische Oberschicht. Die sind alle entsetzt darüber, dass er Wallis Simpson so öffentlich zeigt.
American newspapers were the first to publish pictures of the couple and to report that they had even been spotted bathing in the nude. Now the British press took up the story. What followed was an ordeal for Wallis. As the king's mistress, she'd always been welcome at society parties. But as the future queen, the divorced American was persona non grata. Edward enthused in family circles about the new love in his life, but the royals were shocked by a woman who had 2 ex-husbands and was now angling for a 3rd. Besides, her extravagant lifestyle put a big burden on the king's coffers.
Da Edward VIII. Weiß, dass Wallis ständig Geld braucht und Geschenke braucht, fängt er an, überall einzusparen. Keine Renovierung mehr in den Schlössern, die Gehälter werden gekürzt, alles nur, um Geld zusammenzukratzen, damit man Wallis noch mehr Geschenke machen kann.
Then the head of the Anglican Church, the Archbishop of Canterbury, made a public statement.
Edward VIII, as king, was head of the Church of England, which gave him a special responsibility in the view of the Archbishop of Canterbury and many other people for behaving in a moral way. Having a relationship with a divorced woman was seen as definitely immoral and incompatible.
Wallis saw enemies on all sides. As the pressure increased, she wrote to Edward, "I must go back to Ernest. It's true that we are poor and don't have the means to do the enticing and amusing things that I confess I love and which make me happy, but I am sure that together we are headed for disaster. Edward was horrified and threatened to commit suicide if Wallis left him. Everything now depended on Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin. By law, the marriage of a king needs government approval, but Baldwin had moral scruples and he doubted Edward's ability to be king. And above all, he was worried by Edward's close links to fascism. These became particularly apparent in the autumn of 1936, when Mosley's henchmen were involved in a mass brawl with Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe.
This is a major controversy, it's quite a scandal, and the British public really expected Edward to condemn this outbreak of public disorder, and he says nothing, which is a little bit surprising. We now know that Edward had quite strong anti-Semitic views, as indeed did Wallis Simpson. It was quite usual for members of the aristocracy in Britain and other countries to subscribe to the idea of a Jewish Bolshevik conspiracy, the idea that Jews in Germany and Russia were combining to undermine the establishment in some sort of secret way.
But the infatuated king had no time for everyday politics. He was driven by one question alone: how can I marry Wallis and stay king? Since Wallis had filed for divorce, she'd been pressuring Edward. In a letter, she lamented, "You have broken every woman's heart. I know that you will not marry me either." But at the end of November, Edward told his brother Albert that he was determined to marry Wallis. She was to become his queen and even bear the title of Empress of India. Edward threatened to abdicate if the government refused to approve his marriage to Wallis. Prime Minister Baldwin was torn. Were the king to abdicate, it would trigger a constitutional crisis that could topple his government. Winston Churchill, a close friend of Edward's, suggested a morganatic marriage. That is, Wallis would become the king's wife, but not the queen. Children of the union would also be excluded from succession to the throne.
Das ist eine Idee, die Baldwin, dem Premierminister, vorgelegt wird und die auch Lord Rothermere in der Presse unterstützt. Und Stephanie Hohenlohe verkauft es als ihre Idee. Also sie hat diese morganatische Idee zuerst gehabt. Jedenfalls erzählt sie das Hitler.
Baldwin rejected the idea, convinced that it would be best for England if Edward were to step down as king.
Edward was not somebody who was very punctilious about his royal duties. He wanted to enjoy himself. He didn't see why he had to go through lots of the boring rituals, why he had to do things like opening buildings which weren't very exciting for him.
Edward's supporters enlisted the aid of the press to try to avert an abdication, but only a few people turned out to demonstrate.
The protesters against the abdication were members of the British Union of Fascists who regarded Edward as a war hero, one of their generation, a very sort of admirable species of masculinity, if you will. And they gathered outside Buckingham Palace and chanted slogans against Baldwin and in favour of keeping the king.
Edward sought his mother's approval, but she stood firm. This settled it for the king. He had to abdicate. He would rather renounce the throne than Wallis. Events moved rapidly. On the 11th of December, the king signed a declaration of abdication. It was witnessed by his younger brothers. The new king was to be Edward's shy, stuttering brother Albert, who elected to rule under the name of George VI. The following day, Edward made a final speech on the wireless.
I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king without the help and support of the woman I love.
The king became the Duke of Windsor. He kept the title of Royal Highness and was granted a handsome allowance of £20,000 a year. Today, that would be worth around $2.5 million. Edward had to leave England for 2 years until his brother had become settled on the throne. Edward spent his first months of exile in Austria, on his own, without Wallis. She had gone to the south of France. Until her divorce was finalised, the couple lived in different countries and wrote each other letters. Some of this correspondence has been preserved. It shows that Wallis put pressure on Edward to secure her the best possible deal. Part of this deal was the title of Royal Highness. According to Wallis, only this honorific could restore her standing in the world.
Wallis Simpson glaubt, sie hat ein hohes Ansehen gehabt oder eine große Reputation gehabt bevor dem Skandal. Das war natürlich nicht so. Aber Edward hat ein enormes Schuldgefühl. Er glaubt also, dass die Frau seines Herzens jetzt furchtbar leiden muss, weil sie Drohbriefe bekommt, natürlich, weil die Leute sie hassen für all das, was sie der Royal Family angetan hat. Und er will ihr als Kompensation diesen Titel unbedingt verschaffen.
They planned their wedding by correspondence. American fascist Charles Badeau put the Château de Condé at their disposal. The couple were married there in early June 1937. Wallis now became the Duchess of Windsor. In his excitement, Edward had initially invited over 300 guests, but George VI put paid to those plans and forbade any relatives from attending. In the end, only a handful of close friends were there. This snub was bad, but Edward was even more hurt by a letter from his brother, the new king, in which he wrote that he would not grant Wallis the title of Royal Highness she so desperately desired.
Das ist für Edward also der absolute Schlag ins Gesicht. Und er glaubt tatsächlich, dass sein kleiner Bruder, den er immer unterschätzt hat, weil er der Stotterer in der Familie ist, dass der leicht zu manipulieren ist. Und plötzlich sieht er, dass sein Bruder eine sehr viel stärkere Persönlichkeit ist als er selber. Und dass sein Bruder sich gegen ihn auflehnt und sagt, nein, du bist zu weit gegangen und du bekommst diesmal nicht das, was du willst.
The Windsors spent their honeymoon in Austria in a small castle hotel. But Wallis was in no mood for romance. Instead, she wrote secretly to her ex-husband Ernest. You may be sure that not a day passes in which I do not spend a few hours thinking of you. Love, Wallis. She also bemoaned Ernest's love affair with her childhood friend Mary Kirk. It leaves a wound which will never heal. It hurts so badly.
Wallis Simpson schreibt also an ihren Ex-Mann Liebesbriefe aus den Flitterwochen mit ihrem neuen Mann. Also das ist irgendwie bizarr, aber es zeigt tatsächlich, dass das ein Plan war, der schiefgelaufen war im Grunde. Die beiden wollten zusammen eigentlich nur diesen Prince of Wales, diesen Edward ausnehmen und dann mit sehr viel Juwelen abziehen. Aber es ist nun mal ein ganz anderer Plan daraus entstanden und sie vermisst ihren Mann.
Edward never suspected Wallis's true feelings. He did not even seem to notice that the woman for whom he had given up an empire pined for her ex-husband for years.
Wallis Simpson hat sich dann auch später manchmal beschwert, dass sie also immer diesen Jungen da am Hals hatte. Also sie sieht auch Edward natürlich so als eine Peter-Pan-Figur, als einen kleinen Jungen, den sie ständig also bemuttern muss oder um den sie sich kümmern muss. Und das findet sie auch oft langweilig und belastend, ihn immer um sich zu haben. Aber sie kam ja aus der Sache nicht mehr raus. Also sie mussten zusammenbleiben. Sie waren eine Schicksalsgemeinschaft geworden.
Things picked up after the honeymoon. The Duke and Duchess moved to Paris, where they got a visit from their friend Charles Badeau. The Hitler admirer suggested that Edward and Wallis visit Germany. He promised that Hitler would lay on a grand state reception and that Edward would be able to form a picture of the new Germany. Edward took the bait. The prospect of Wallis being treated like a queen in Nazi Germany clinched it. In Paris, Charles Badeau introduced the Windsors to a German negotiator, Fritz Wiedemann, Hitler's personal adjutant.
Fritz Wiedemann, together with Stephanie von Hohenlohe, drew up an itinerary for Edward which involved a number of points which were supposed to be of special interest to him. He met Himmler, he met Ribbentrop, he met Goering, he met Goebbels, and the high point, the culmination of the visit, was to be a meeting with Hitler.
Edward's uncle, Karl Eduard, had suggested a meeting with Hitler in 1936.
Der Herzog von Coburg meldet 1936, dass er Eduard VIII. Getroffen hat und dass der König ihm gesagt hat, ich möchte Hitler sehen, Baldwin ist nicht wichtig, ich bin hier der Herr im Lande und ich werde Hitler treffen.
On the 11th of October 1937, the Windsors went to Berlin by train. There they started their 12-day tour of the Reich. The reception was as regal as if Edward was still king. Their official host was Robert Ley, head of the German Labour Front. He showed Edward and Wallis the showcase projects of the Third Reich, including the Krupp armaments works in Essen and an SS training unit. As planned, they also met high-ranking Nazi officials. And Hitler received the couple at the Berghof. Joseph Goebbels, who had scorned Edward after his abdication in June for not acting like a man, now took another tone in his diary.
Goebbels' comments in his diary on Wallis Simpson were that she would have been a good queen, that he noted that Hitler referred to her as Your Royal Highness. Of course, that was the title which she so desperately craved. And he found Edward to be a charming, likeable chap with a common sense approach to life, and said it was a great pity that Edward was no longer king, because with him an alliance would have been possible.
Edward's equerry, Dudley Forward, was also at this meeting. He later wrote that Edward had told Hitler, "We are both of the same race. The blood of the Hun flows through German and British veins." In 2015, a photo album was sold at auction. In it were photos which left no doubt as to Edward's political leanings. In two pictures, the Duke of Windsor is clearly making a Nazi salute. He himself denied this to his life's end.
Diese Reise ist ein enormer Propagandacoup für das nationalsozialistische Deutschland. Hitler bezahlt auch alles, also die Reisekosten werden bezahlt, die Hotels etc. Und Edward ist natürlich zwar der Ex-König, aber im Denken der Nationalsozialisten ist immer noch die Idee, vielleicht haben wir ja noch eine Chance, ihn zurück auf den Thron zu bringen.
But a German-British alliance never eventuated. On the 1st of September 1939, Hitler's Wehrmacht invaded Poland. The British stood by their Polish allies and declared war on Germany. And Edward? The ex-king was still highly regarded by the British fascists. In the spring of 1939, aristocratic right-wing radicals had founded the Right Club. Their goal was to topple the government, depose George VI and install Edward as head of state in a fascist kingdom with Hitler's backing. The founder of the Right Club was Sir Archibald Ramsay.
Archibald Ramsay, the key figure in the Right Club, was a Conservative MP who, in the later 1930s, became extremely anti-Semitic and linked the Jews and the Bolsheviks in his mind in a kind of global conspiracy to drag Britain into war.
Among the 230 members of the secret fascist society were several aristocratic parliamentarians, such as the Duke of Wellington, the Duke of Westminster, and the publisher Lord Redesdale, an admirer of Hitler. Oswald Mosley, Britain's #1 Nazi, was also one of the plotters.
Actually, a lot of the files about this have been destroyed. What is clear is that quite a large number of senior Conservative politicians, people in the House of Lords particularly, were pro-German and in some cases pro-Hitler. Some of these people think that actually when there's a deal with Hitler, they might be the people running Britain.
Tyler Kent, an employee at the American Embassy in London, also supported the rightists. As a cipher clerk, he knew that England's new Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, was sending pleas for help to President Roosevelt without consulting Parliament, even though Congress and the American people had voted against joining the war. In early May 1940, the Right Club tried to leak Churchill's secret correspondence. They also planned to inform Parliament, hoping it would rise up against him. The intelligence service received a last-minute tip-off. Churchill had the leaders of the Right Club arrested and was able to avert a coup.
Very large numbers of people were initially interned. They were given different categories. And during the war, these people are gradually released. So initially, many people are interned. And eventually, halfway through the war, it's only the really extreme people like Mosley, for example, who were still being held.
Barely 2 months later, Hitler and his foreign minister Ribbentrop took up the Right Club's plan. After German troops defeated France in just 5 weeks, Berlin was convinced that Britain could also be brought quickly to her knees. After that, Edward was to become a puppet king, ruling with Hitler's backing. The Duke had lived in exile in France since his abdication. But when German troops invaded France, he and Wallis moved to Spain and then to Portugal.
Essentially, they're waiting there to see what will happen next. And the Germans see this as an opportunity. So clearly Hitler, Ribbentrop see Edward as a potential pro-German ally. It's very clear that the Germans had elaborate plans to either persuade or even perhaps kidnap Edward and Wallis.
Evidence of Germany's abduction plans can be found in a secret FBI dossier from the 1940s. In it, Edward and Wallis were accused of a variety of offences. The FBI classified them as dangerous Nazi collaborators. Most of the evidence concerns the Duchess. The secret documents allege that Wallis collaborated with Hitler's foreign minister Joachim von Ribbentrop and passed state secrets onto him. One informer is particularly credible, a Benedictine monk by the name of Odo.
Pate Odo war eng verwandt mit Queen Mary und er war sich ganz sicher, dass Wallis Simpson immer einen Backchannel, einen Kanal nach Deutschland hatte und über Ribbentrop immer mit den Deutschen Kontakt aufnehmen konnte.
According to Father Otto, Wallis always let German agents know of any change of residence. Operation Willy was the code name for a plan to move the couple to a neutral country, where the ex-king would await England's defeat.
Pater Odo war informiert darüber, dass Wallis Simpson alles versuchen wollte, um ihren Mann wieder auf den Thron zu bringen. Und dazu war auch die Operation Willi angelegt, denn die Deutschen versuchten, Kontakt mit den Royals in Spanien aufzunehmen und den Herzog von Windsor zu entführen.
In the secret dossier, Father Otto hinted at a love affair between the Duchess of Windsor and the German foreign minister. But there's no evidence of a dalliance. Historians have hunted for decades for proof of Edward's willingness to cooperate with the Nazis. Historian Karina Urbach recently found some clues in the dispatches of a Spanish diplomat. They shine fresh light on the matter.
Der Herzog von Windsor hat einen ganz alten Freund, einen Spanier, der Tiger genannt wird, Bermejillo. Und Bermejillo, den trifft er sofort, als er in Madrid ankommt. Und dem erzählt er natürlich alles über seine politischen Ideen. Und Bermejillo meldet das sofort weiter ans spanische Außenministerium.
They immediately informed their friends in Germany. Bermejillo's reports have been lying forgotten, gathering dust in the General Archive in Madrid. Karina Urbach's interest was piqued by an extraordinary observation of Edward's. According to Bermejillo, the ex-king said of the imminent German air raids on London, "If one bombed England effectively, this could bring peace." The ex-king seems actually to be wishing for the defeat of his own country.
Es ist eine schockierende Aussage, weil es natürlich zeigt, dass Edward im Grunde die Seiten gewechselt hat. Er ist auf der Seite Hitlers, auf der Seite Deutschlands. Wir wissen nicht, ob deswegen tatsächlich dann die Bombardierung 2 Wochen später passierte, ob das der Auslöser war. Aber wir wissen, dass diese Botschaft nach Deutschland gelangte, dass sogar Edward, der ehemalige König, diese Bombardierung verlangte.
Edward allegedly wanted the Germans to defeat England with a blitzkrieg and then negotiate a moderate peace.
Edward trifft Bermejillo noch zu einem zweiten Gespräch und das ist im Grunde noch schockierender, weil er Bermejillo da sagt, also er glaubt, für den ganzen Krieg wären nur die Roten, also die Kommunisten verantwortlich, die Juden und Anthony Eden im Auswärtigen Amt, also das sind alles Volltrottel und er würde sie am liebsten gegen eine Wand stellen, denn er wäre der Mann, der diesen Frieden verhandeln kann.
When Prime Minister Winston Churchill learned of Operation Willi, he decided to get Edward out of the possible clutches of the Germans and send him to a far corner of the empire, the Bahamas. Edward and Wallis hesitated, but Churchill issued an order. The Windsors were to leave on the next ship. If Edward refused, Churchill would have him court-martialed. The threat worked. The Duke and Duchess left Lisbon in August 1940. Less than 3 weeks later, they arrived in Nassau, where Edward stayed until the end of the war as governor of the British colony. Churchill thought Edward was safely out of the way, but he was wrong. It's only a short boat journey from the Bahamas to the US. The Windsors went there most weekends, officially to visit doctors or friends. Actually, they were trying to undermine Churchill's attempts to win America over as an ally in the war against Nazi Germany.
I think the worst thing that Edward did and that Wallis did was to try and encourage very important and powerful Americans to stay neutral, to convince them not to support Britain, not to do Lend-Lease when Britain was in its most perilous position. This, I think, tells you quite a lot about Edward's thinking.
Even on official occasions, Edward and Wallis put pressure on the US military and the American president, Roosevelt, to stay out of the war in Europe. Up until the day America entered the war, the former king still hoped that Germany would win and return him to the political stage. The end of the war marked the end of Edward's time as governor of the Bahamas. He and Wallis never returned to England.
Wir wissen, dass Edward und Wallis nach dem Krieg im Grunde unverbesserlich blieben. Sie haben nie bereut, was sie damals gesagt und gedacht haben. Sie sind eng befreundet mit Mosley und seiner Frau und sie leben in diesem Luxusexil in Frankreich und sind immer noch ganz rechts außen und immer noch der Meinung, dass sie alles richtig gemacht haben.
For many years, the Duke and Duchess lived a life of luxury as part of the jet set. They never abandoned their conviction that Edward would have made a better king of England. A king who'd been prepared to betray his country if it meant getting his throne back.